Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda Ever.Ag's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back again with some more market updates, a little bit of weather, which is interesting at the moment. Some of the key issues in our outlook that is just being finalised this week. Of course, GDT and Chart of the Week.
It's a big update, actually.
It's a big list.
Yeah, let's move into it.
So firstly, I guess the big movers in the outlook at the moment, Steve, is around what's happening with Europe supplies. So EU prices for cream and milk continue to climb, don't they? We're past the spring peak, but there's still a bit of an expectation that milk production is going to struggle. So the EX butter futures didn't really move much, a little bit weaker later and a little bit stronger in the short term there, Steve. And in terms of what's happening with over-the-counter trade, just seeing a bit more firmness in that over-the-counter trade than the futures are suggesting there. So interesting time for butter trade at the moment in Europe, Steve.
A bit more belief in the difficulty of supply later in the year. It seems coming through there. Looking at skim, though, similar issue really. That's reasonable uplift. We haven't seen much action in the skim market, even though liquids have been, we didn't have that on the previous chart, but the skim milk concentrate is rising in value, seems to be putting a bit more pressure on this, and certainly the trades are coming through at higher values. Now, last week, Joe, we talked about weather and the dryness in Europe. Well, things are changing pretty quickly. This is rain up to yesterday over the past week, showing it's reasonable and certainly good falls in Ireland, which has changed that situation quite well. The UK also is now talking that they've had a break and that the outlook changes. But continental Europe has also had some rain, but there's more coming, and there's some fairly large weather events expected in the next few days, just in time for us to go there. We'll just see how this plays out. I mean, these are large storms, so it could be quite violent weather, and will that actually change anything? But this could alter the dynamic about the effect of dryness that is putting fear of limited supply into people. Mm-hmm. This is certainly one to watch as it develops. So we're issuing an outlook tomorrow, Joe, and by the time people pick up this video, it's probably in their inboxes, those subscribers. But look, we don't want to talk through this whole table, but just to call out a few of the more interesting things that are moving, and really this is trying to capture all the moving parts and the most important burning issues, as we call them, around the outlook. What would you call out here, Joe's being, most pertinent?
Yeah, we've already talked about the EU milk supply situation, and I guess that's really driving things at the moment. Also, what's happening in the US, we've been talking for a long time about the new capacity coming on stream in terms of what that will do to supply and export competition. But we're seeing a bit of volatility in the market, Steve, just as those new plants ramp up and run into a few technical difficulties, or struggle to actually get the milk. So
yeah, I think the slower filling of that new capacity is altering the dynamic and altering the fundamentals in our outlook. So we're kind of pushing that production lift back. The other thing there, the cream glut is certainly easing and bringing cream multiples back into similar territory as on average, but that is also changing the outlook for the butterfat market in the US.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, obviously, Steve, New Zealand, perhaps a little bit better of an outlook for milk production there. It's also raining in New Zealand at the moment. And they've had a price forecast from Fonterra that most Kiwi farmers would be pretty comfortable with and prospected better margins. So will be interesting to watch in the next couple of months, particularly with those very strong production conditions last year.
So still a really mixed bag, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
We haven't even mentioned tariffs.
We haven't.
So GDT 381, sort of a similar feel. We're down 1.6%. Whole milk powder lost some ground. New Zealand product lost nearly 4% in second contract. Worse later to flatten out that curve. The European price, incidentally, went up 6% on the strength of the butter and protein markets there. Skim lost some ground. Medium heat, European product went up. Butter was down. Losses were much worse later in the case of butter, but AMF, fifth rally, its fifth increase in GDT events, so that's pretty interesting. But we see, cheddar had another beating. It dropped significantly last time, and another 5% on average this time. So that's an interesting situation as well.
Yeah, just looking into some of the contrasting performances, I guess, between fat and cheese from different origins. EU butter was again following market conditions in Europe, a bit firmer at this event, whereas New Zealand butter was a little bit softer. We did have a bit more butter available at this event than was originally forecast, and about 20% more available compared to event number 380. So that may have been a factor. Mozzarella was firmer, up 0.4% for Solaric to 4,320 euros a tonne. Arla was slightly lower, and that translates to around $2.23 per pound in US speak. And it compares with last week's EX report of about 4,277. So, roughly in that neighbourhood, isn't it, Steve? Stronger demand persists for butter. Whole milk powder was also well above average, and the demand for AMF, as you said, another improvement in prices at this event, pretty strong demand compared to average for this event number 381.
So looking at some of the price movements, the whole milk powder curve, it's lost its bump as well. So the curve, more gentle ski slope here down to, lower levels, but, still around 4,000 when you get out to CP5. But it's finished well ahead of where the futures were for the second contract there, which is quite interesting, Joe.
Just putting that in context of Pulse and recent GDT events, it's back in line with last week's Pulse result for whole milk powder contract 2. So just a gentle relaxation there, Steve.
Yeah.
And in terms of involvement, and Chinese involvement lifted to over 50% on a slightly better tonnage. So that's probably a little bit encouraging, even though the whole milk powder price did fall.
Skim milk powder, the curve certainly flattened out here, but finished below futures this time. So little interesting. The curve is quite flat after that previous bump that it had in CP3.
Yeah, and just again, looking at that longer trend, continued the trend set in Pulse for skim milk powder too. So a bit more of a downward curve there. But again, wow, that event number 379 really sticks out, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Something was going on there. In terms of skim milk powder, it was Southeast Asian buyers that lifted the tonnage at this event, Steve, just up compared to the previous event and compared to last year.
Just lining up skim milk powder prices, which, they've come together quite closely, and that's with, quite a fall in the New Zealand price and the European product moving higher. Certainly a lot higher than what we're seeing on the ground in Europe, particularly futures markets. So it's interesting how GDT is, I guess, reflecting a bit more enthusiasm for skim than they are in the rest of the market.
And just looking at the butter dynamics there, again, a bit more product available at this event than was expected and more than last event, as well as improved prospects, I guess, Steve, for New Zealand availability later in the year. Just seeing that butter curve relax a little bit at this event.
Yeah, that's becoming a bit more apparent, isn't it?
And likewise, AMF discount to New Zealand butter also weakened at this event, so a little bit less of a gap at the C2 contract. And I love this too. The whole milk powder price premium has narrowed a little bit, so come back a bit more in line with the analogue product, just reflecting firmer EU skim milk powder and better AMF prices. And here we have this skim milk powder. Well, it's all tangled up there now. It's really tightened up in terms of the spread between the various regions. So a lot different to what we were seeing in the last couple of weeks, Steve. And in terms of the butter comparison, well, GDT has kind of landed right in the middle of very high European prices and lower New Zealand futures prices. You would have to think that the New Zealand futures are a bit more on the money, but it'll be interesting to see how that develops in the next little while.
So, chart of the week, Joe, how will you bring this home?
Well, we're back in the States, actually, Steve, and we're just looking at what's happened in terms of milk margins in the US. And this is obviously very important in terms of filling those cheese plants and what's happening with milk production. The recent cheese rally that we've seen on the CME will steady that in the short term because it looks like quite a precipitous drop earlier this year for the first little bit of this year, Steve. So we've just seen those class prices diverge into Q4 and into Q1 26. Feed prices will be a little bit weaker going forward just with what's happened on the grain markets, but it's going to be interesting to see what really happens in terms of milk production over the rest of 2025, Steve.
You'd have to think they're good numbers to lock in, but we won't give that recommendation. But I mean, in terms of what we see, the headwinds we see in the cheese market going forward with the production as it gradually fills those plants and pretty weak domestic demand still, and that's not getting any better. So that looks a pretty good prognosis. We might see a bit more milk than what we might have thought. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks very much for watching. We'll be back again next week from Europe.